The role of the Democrats in the current system is to intentionally lose. I hope you'll let me explain, because as we navigate the tricky intersectional ethics of the upcoming 2024 election and beyond, it's important that we begin to understand this in our bones. 50 years ago, the U.S. had two political parties, Republicans and Democrats, and both had genuine public support, and both platforms held some public appeal. And then the right wing realized that there was unimaginable money to be made from corporate campaign funding, so they abandoned their entire platform and dedicated themselves completely to allowing the exploitation of the environment and the working class to give every single penny to the ultra-rich. Paid really well, but there was no way they were going to win elections with that as a platform, because it amounted to a giant middle finger to the working class and their voter base, so they needed to mobilize a new voter base. They looked at a few options and settled on evangelical fundamentalist Christians, who were previously pretty apolitical. In order to buy their votes, the Republican Party turned on a dime in the 1980s and became rabidly pro-life. Before this, the Republicans were openly pro-choice, because abortion is a personal right, and they were the party advocating personal rights. This marked the start of the modern culture wars, where the right invents boogeymen to terrify their base into ignoring the fact that their entire platform is basically steal all your money and give it to the rich, while destroying the environment we live in. The Democrats quickly followed suit, starting with Clinton. They also abandoned any actual representation of their base for corporate cash grabs, including massively lucrative arms deals and warmongering, in order to funnel billions through the Pentagon into their corporate funders' pockets. So the only two major political parties in the most powerful country in the history of the world both completely sold out to corporate interests some 30 to 40 years ago, which has led to an ever-widening gap between public opinion and legislation. For example, polling shows that some 70% of Americans have wanted some form of universal health care for decades, but it's barred from even being seriously discussed. Citizens of the U.S. are shockingly aligned on most major issues. We all want the rich to pay taxes, not to watch our neighbors and families die from easily preventable medical issues, living wages, fair elections, breathable air, and not bombing of babies. Corporations want the exact opposite, or more accurately, they want the record-breaking profits they can extract from the opposite. This creates a real quandary for both Republicans and Democrats alike. How do you continue to get votes while aggressively working against everything your voters want? You already know the answer. They stage a farce where they pretend to be bitter enemies, and like any abuser, they both claim that they are the only ones who can keep you safe from the other. The Republicans pretend that they are the only thing preventing straight white Christians from being hunted for sport by hordes of black and brown trans drug dealers screaming pronouns and making up new genders. The Democrats pretend that they are the only ones who can save you from the coal-guzzling fascists literally storming the Capitol. The fact that one boogeyman is totally fictional and the other is very real doesn't change their tactical exploitation and the presentation of themselves as your only hope at all. And they've gotten really good at this dance. They do a great job at it now. They look genuinely enraged at each other as they denounce the other side of the aisle, while all of them vote unanimously for the same tax cuts for the rich and bloated military budgets and genocides that line their funders' pockets. The Republicans have it easy. Their platform of culture war has no relationship to their corporate funders, so when they get into office, they can do most of what they say they will. They'll criminalize abortion, defund social services, cut taxes, but only on the rich, never for you, institute a brutal police state, terrorize immigrants and LGBTQ people. The Democrats have a real problem, though. Their nominal platform is at odds with their corporate sponsors, so they do the only logical thing from that position. They intentionally lose. Every time they make a catch, win an election, they intentionally fumble the ball. We're all so used to seeing this farcical dance that we can't even really register it anymore, but the Democrats have had the Senate, House, and presidency simultaneously multiple times in the last few decades. At any one of those times, they could have actually made change. They could have codified Roe versus Wade. They could have passed legislation eliminating all student debt. They could have cut military spending, taxed the rich, passed universal health care. They could have capped emissions and maintained a livable environment. Our country and world could be very, very different than it is. It really doesn't have to be like this. But if they did those things, they would then gain massive public support and actually run the country, but they would lose all their corporate funding. So that's not actually what they want. So they keep this incredibly fragile balance, where since the Clinton years, where the Democrats sold out, the balance of power has been carefully maintained at almost exactly 50-50, giving both parties the ability to point the finger and blame the other for not getting anything done. It didn't used to be like that. The party that better represented the will of the population used to just win and then do what the people wanted. Like the 75th Congress, some 90 years ago, was 344 to 88. Because the Democrats, who held the 344, maintained a 95% tax on the rich and actually subsidized social services and education. If today's Democrats simply adopted the platform of their own party from 90 years ago, they would win every election in a landslide. But they actively don't want to win. For many of us millennials, this was really driven home by the 2016 election cycle. Polls were crystal clear. In every single poll, Bernie Sanders beat Trump by double digits and Hillary Clinton lost to Trump. The DNC pulled out all the stops. They lied, cheated, stole so much in order to force Sanders out and put Clinton up as the candidate that it was impossible not to see it. It looked insane to many of us. We felt crazy. I remember literally watching them kick Sanders delegates out for asking questions that they didn't want to answer at the Democratic National Convention in Maine. I remember watching them shut down polling places where Sanders had strong leads. All the things that the MAGA thinks happened in the 2020 election, the DNC literally did and didn't even bother to hide in 2016. They were taken to court for it, and they didn't even deny that they rigged the primary. They just said, hey, we're a private company. We're under zero obligation to run fair elections. We can nominate whoever we want. The voting is just a farce. That was their legal argument, and they won with it. I remember hearing people scream at the DNC officials, do you want to lose? And slowly understanding that, yeah, that was exactly what they wanted. They would literally rather lose with Clinton than win with Sanders. Because when they lose, they can then say, gosh darn it, we tried, but they won this round. Please donate more. They get to look like the good guys who keep trying but just keep getting beaten down by the forces of fascism and racism and hate. As losers, they're noble victims. But when they win, they have real problems like what we're seeing now with Biden, where they have to try and hide the fact that they are also the forces of fascism and racism and hate. If Trump had won, he'd likely be doing the exact same thing, but it would be normal. We'd all expect it, and the DNC would fundraise like crazy. When a Democrat commits genocide, though, we're supposed to see it as atypical. Unflinchingly committing genocide is supposed to read as, oh, a little oopsie from an otherwise ethical, humanitarian, democratic leader. The fact that the Republican platform doesn't interfere with their corporate interests and therefore they can enact the policies they promise to, while the Democrats have to constantly appear to fumble and fail in their oh-so-genuine efforts to create change, has, of course, led to the rightward drift of U.S. politics over the last decades, to the point where Republican elected officials are now openly saying out loud that we should kill all Palestinians, while the House just voted near unanimously that anyone who says we should not commit genocide must be anti-Semitic. That shift is noteworthy. If any politician had stood up and publicly said that we should kill all of a given race 50 years ago, they would have rightfully been called a Nazi and lost all public credulity. Today, that's accepted on the floor of a state house, while opposing genocide is condemned and literally censured. That's pretty intense, and it's like that across the board. The only thing that matters in political discourse is controlling the parameters of the narrative. What is outside the bounds on each side? If you control these two bookends, then the content of what is said in between them becomes wholly irrelevant. Both bookends have been steadily shifting to the right for a long time, to the point where now right-wing politicians openly advocate ethnic cleansing, and left-wing politicians just quietly fund ethnic cleansing. And anything to the left of funding ethnic cleansing is literally censored. Remember how 100 years ago the Democrats controlled like 80% of Congress and they taxed the rich at 95% in a way that gave the U.S. the strongest economy in the history of the world? Now, if any elected official is crazy enough to suggest that the rich should pay any taxes at all, they're labeled as communists and laughed out of the room. So I paid more taxes than Jeff Bezos last year. The cost of living's through the roof, federal minimum wage is still $7.25, and we're watching our tax dollars bomb babies. But the Democrats, who are currently the ones bombing babies, are our saviors. And if we just vote for them a little bit more, then they'll save us all. Most notable in all of this is that if anyone speaks up who actually represents the will of the American people, they're mocked and driven out of the conversation. So people like Claudia de la Cruz or Cornel West are effectively barred from any presence in the mainstream media, or if they are covered, it's as an anomaly and immediately condemned as stealing votes from the real candidates. Notice that framing. It's not that Biden or Trump are losing through their complete failure to represent anything like what the people want. It's that anyone who represents what the people want is stealing votes from them. If you'd like to understand the mechanisms and expressions of this political narrative of control better, I can't recommend Chomsky enough. Since reading his masterwork, Manufacturing Consent, a Propaganda Model of the Media, I have never seen the world the same way. That book is dense, but he covers the same content in a much more digestible fashion in the 1988 CBC Massey lectures titled Necessary Illusions, which is also in print as a book by the same name. But that's a 4-hour lecture set from 35 years ago, and it's worth every second. But don't take my word for it. Just watch and look at the track record. If the Democrats wanted to win, they'd do what 75% of the country wants and stop funding genocide and enact a ceasefire. But they're doing the exact opposite, and it may very well have the effect of putting Trump back into office. As you watch that play out, or whatever the next scenario is where the Democrats fail or look wildly inept, just remember this video and compare what you're seeing to the idea that they want to lose. If they wanted to win, we all know how they could. They're not doing that. So ask yourself what priorities would lead to their actual ineffective course of action, and whether those priorities align with yours, your neighbors, and those of everyone who wants a safe, livable world.